When 16-year-old Emma Sullivan stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Ridge, Montana, the dozen ranch hands gathered at the station burst into laughter. They nudged each other, pointing at the small, mud-splattered girl, clutching a worn leather satchel, her eyes darting nervously across the unfamiliar faces. The town had been expecting a seasoned ranch hand from back east, someone who could handle horses, mend fences, and pull their weight during the brutal winter months ahead. Instead, they got her. That's the help old man Calloway hired. One ranch hand wheezed between laughs. She looks like a strong wind could snap her in half. But when weathered rancher Jacob Calloway stepped forward and performed a single deliberate gesture with his hands, the entire crowd fell silent. Emma's face transformed, fear melting into shock, then flooding with tears of relief. What happened next would challenge everything. This isolated Montana community thought they knew about strength, communication, and what it truly means to be heard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Montana Territory in 1889 was unforgiving country. The landscape stretched endlessly under vast skies, rolling prairies that gave way to jagged mountain peaks, thick forests of lodgepole pine, and rivers so cold they could steal the breath from your lungs. It was a place where survival demanded every ounce of strength a person possessed, where weakness was a luxury no one could afford, and where the harsh realities of frontier life had little patience for those who couldn't keep pace. Copper Ridge sat in a valley 40 miles south of Helena, a settlement of perhaps 200 souls who had carved out existence from stubborn soil and stubborn hope. The town consisted of a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a blacksmith's forge, a modest hotel, and Murphy's saloon, where deals were struck, news was shared, and reputations were made or destroyed over whiskey that burned going down. The heart of the local economy was ranching. Cattle operations sprawled across the valley, each ranch marked by its brand and run by families who measured their wealth in livestock and land rather than cash. The Circle C Ranch, owned by Jacob Calloway, was the largest operation within 50 miles, 3,000 acres of grazing land, 200 head of cattle, and a reputation for fair dealings that made Calloway one of the most respected men in the territory. At 63 years old, Jacob Calloway had seen Montana transform from wild frontier to something approaching civilization. Though civilization was a generous term for a place where grizzly bears still raided livestock and winter storms could trap families in their homes for weeks at a time. His face was weathered leather carved deep with lines that spoke of decades spent under the sun and wind. His hands were calloused and scarred from a lifetime of hard work, building fences, breaking horses, pulling calves during difficult births, and doing the 1,000 other tasks that kept a ranch running. Jacob had never been a man of many words. Even before his wife Margaret died 7 years prior, he'd been known for his silence, for communicating more through actions than speech. Margaret had been his opposite, warm, talkative, filling their modest ranch house with chatter and laughter. When pneumonia took her during a particularly brutal winter, something in Jacob closed off even further. He retreated into his work, into the rhythms of ranch life that required no explanation or conversation. His only son, Thomas, had moved to San Francisco 5 years ago, drawn by opportunities the city offered that Montana couldn't match. They exchanged letters twice a year, brief, factual updates that contained little warmth. Thomas had urged his father to sell the ranch and move to California, to live comfortably in his declining years. But Jacob couldn't imagine leaving the land he'd spent his life building. This was his home. This was where Margaret was buried. This was where he would die, but running a ranch alone was becoming impossible. The winter of 1888 had been devastating, temperatures dropping so low that cattle froze standing up, snowdrifts reaching the eaves of buildings, supplies running desperately short. Jacob had lost 30 head that winter, and only his two most loyal ranch hands, Pete Holbrook and Samuel Sam Chen, A Chinese immigrant who'd proven himself invaluable despite the prejudice he faced, had stayed on through the worst of it. By spring, it was clear Jacob needed help. Not just seasonal hands for roundup and branding, but someone who could assist with the daily operations year-round. Someone reliable, hard-working, and willing to endure the isolation that came with ranch life. Through a friend in Helena, he'd contacted an employment agency back east that specialized in placing workers on frontier properties. The agency's letter had been encouraging. They'd found a candidate with extensive experience in agricultural work, exceptional dedication, and a strong desire to make a new start in the West. The worker would arrive in Copper Ridge on the morning stagecoach on September 15th. Jacob had sent money for the journey and made arrangements to meet the coach. What he hadn't known, what the agency's carefully worded letter had deliberately obscured, was that Emma Sullivan was deaf, had been since birth, and that her extensive experience consisted of 3 years working in near-slavery conditions on a farm in Pennsylvania, where her disability made her easy to exploit. September 15th dawned clear and crisp, with the first hints of autumn color touching the aspens on the mountainsides. Jacob rode into town on his mare, arriving at the station just as the stagecoach from Helena rattled down the main street in a cloud of dust. A small crowd had gathered. They always did when the coach arrived, hungry for news from the outside world, packages from mail-order catalogs, or the occasional new face that might break the monotony of small-town life. Pete and Sam had accompanied Jacob, along with half a dozen other ranch hands from neighboring properties who'd come to town for supplies. They clustered near the station, joking and speculating about what kind of man the old rancher had hired. Probably some city fellow who thinks he knows everything about ranching from reading books. Pete laughed. He was 35, built like a bull, with a booming voice and opinions he shared freely. Maybe a farm boy from Iowa, another hand suggested. Someone used to real work, not like these mining types who think swinging a pickaxe is hard labor. The stagecoach pulled to a stop, and the driver climbed down to begin unloading luggage. 3 passengers disembarked, a traveling salesman carrying cases of samples, a middle-aged woman returning to visit family, and finally, Emma Sullivan. She was small. That was the first thing everyone noticed. At 5 feet tall and barely 100 pounds, she looked more like a child than a 16-year-old, though her eyes held a wariness that suggested she'd already lived through more than most children should. Her dress was cheap calico, faded from too many washings, with patches at the elbows and hem. Her boots were worn, the leather cracked and poorly mended. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her face was smudged with the dust and grime of several days' travel. She stepped down from the coach, clutching a leather satchel, the kind doctors carried, but old and battered, and looked around with an expression of barely concealed panic. Her eyes swept across the crowd, searching for something or someone, finding only strangers staring back with varying degrees of confusion and amusement. The laughter started almost immediately. "That's your new hand?" Pete guffawed, slapping his knee. "Calloway, did you order from a catalogue and get the child's size by mistake?" The other ranch hands joined in, their laughter rolling across the station. Even townspeople who'd gathered began chuckling, though some looked uncomfortable with the mockery. Emma's face flushed deep red, but she held her ground, her jaw setting with stubborn determination even as her hands trembled. "She looks like she'd blow away in a stiff wind," another hand called out. "What's she gonna do, knit us sweaters while we work?" Jacob stood apart from the group, studying the girl with an expression that revealed nothing. He'd expected someone older, certainly, someone larger and stronger, but he'd learned long ago that appearances could deceive, that true strength wasn't always visible to the eye. Something about the way Emma held herself, chin up despite the humiliation, shoulders squared against the ridicule, reminded him of Margaret, who'd been small too, but possessed a steel core that had carried them through hardships that broke larger men. As the laughter continued, Emma's eyes finally found Jacob. He was the only one not laughing, the only one watching her with something other than mockery or pity. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of fellow outsiders in a world that had little patience for those who didn't fit the mold. Jacob stepped forward, moving through the crowd with the quiet authority that came from decades of leadership. The laughter began to die down as the men realized their boss was approaching. He stopped a few feet from Emma, and then deliberately and clearly, he raised his hands and began to sign. His movements were careful, practiced, not fluid like a native signer, but competent enough to be understood. "Welcome to Copper Ridge," his hands said. "I am Jacob Calloway. You must be Emma Sullivan." The effect on Emma was instantaneous and profound. Her eyes went wide with shock, her mouth falling open as she stared at the weathered rancher forming signs with his scarred, work-roughened hands. For a moment she stood frozen, unable to believe what she was seeing. Then tears began streaming down her face, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief, of unexpected hope, of finally being seen by someone who'd bothered to learn her language. Her hands flew up in response, signing with the rapid fluency of someone who'd spent their entire life communicating this way. "You know sign language?" she asked, her face transforming from fear and shame to desperate hope. "You learned it for me." The crowd had fallen completely silent now, watching this strange exchange with confusion and growing curiosity. They saw the rancher's hands moving, saw the girl's tear-stained face light up, saw something happening they didn't understand but could sense was significant. Jacob nodded, then signed again. "I received your file from the agency 3 weeks ago. When I learned you were deaf, I found books. I practiced. My signing is not perfect, but we will learn together." Emma's hands moved again, faster now. "They said you didn't know. The agency promised they'd tell you. I was so afraid you'd send me back when you found out." "Everyone always sends me back." "I don't send people back," Jacob signed. "I judge people by their work and their character, not by what they can or cannot hear." "Can you work hard?" "Yes," Emma signed emphatically. "I'm stronger than I look. I learn quickly." "I won't disappoint you." Jacob turned to face the crowd, particularly the ranch hands who'd been laughing moments before. His voice, when he spoke aloud, carried the weight of absolute authority. "This is Emma Sullivan. She'll be working at the Circle C. She's deaf, which means she communicates with her hands instead of her voice. It doesn't mean she's stupid, weak, or incapable. Anyone who treats her with disrespect answers to me. Are we clear?" The silence that followed was profound. Pete looked like he'd been slapped, his face flushed with embarrassment. The other hands shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Jacob's stern gaze. Even the townspeople who'd been snickering seemed chastened by the rancher's words, and by the obvious care he'd taken to learn sign language for this girl he'd never met. "Now," Jacob continued, "someone help load Miss Sullivan's belongings onto my wagon. We have a 40-minute ride back to the ranch, and there's work to be done before sunset." As the crowd dispersed, still murmuring with surprise and confusion, Jacob turned back to Emma and signed, "Are you hungry? We'll stop at the general store for supplies." "You can tell me what you need." Emma wiped her tears with the back of her hand and signed, "I don't need much. Just a chance. Just someone to give me a chance." Jacob's weathered face softened almost imperceptibly. "Everyone deserves a chance," he signed. "Now come, let me show you what will be your home." As they walked toward the wagon, Emma clutching her battered satchel, Jacob moving with the slow, steady gait of a man who'd spent his life on horseback, neither of them could have imagined how this moment would reshape not just their own lives, but the entire community of Copper Ridge. How Emma's arrival would challenge every assumption about disability, communication, and human worth. How a deaf girl and a taciturn rancher would forge an unlikely partnership that would prove more powerful than anyone had dreamed possible. The laughter at the station had been cruel but predictable. The frontier had little patience for difference, little room for those who didn't fit the standard mold. But what those laughing men didn't understand, what they couldn't have known in that moment, was that they'd just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. They'd witnessed the moment when Jacob Calloway made a choice that would define the rest of his life. The choice to see past disability and limitation, to recognize potential where others saw only weakness, to extend dignity to someone the world had taught to expect nothing but rejection. And Emma Sullivan, standing beside the wagon as Jacob loaded her small bundle of belongings, felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. Hope. Real tangible hope that maybe, just maybe, this weathered rancher with his careful signs and stern defense might be the first person to truly see her not as a burden or a charity case, but as someone capable, valuable, and worthy of respect. The sun climbed higher in the Montana sky as the wagon rolled out of Copper Ridge, carrying a deaf girl and a silent rancher toward a future neither could predict. Behind them, the town buzzed with gossip and speculation. Ahead of them, the Circle C Ranch waited, 3,000 acres of possibility, challenge, and the chance for both of them to discover that communication has nothing to do with sound, and everything to do with the willingness to be understood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wagon ride to the Circle C Ranch stretched across landscape that seemed to have no end. Emma sat beside Jacob on the wooden bench, her satchel clutched in her lap, watching as Copper Ridge disappeared behind them and the vast Montana wilderness opened up ahead. The dirt road wound through stands of pine and across open meadows where elk grazed in the distance, their heads lifting to watch the wagon pass before returning to their feeding. Jacob didn't attempt conversation during the journey, which suited Emma fine. She was exhausted from days of travel, from Pennsylvania to Chicago by train, then another train to Helena, then the bone-rattling stagecoach to Copper Ridge. But more than physical exhaustion, she felt the weight of years of disappointment and rejection pressing down on her shoulders. This was her 7th placement in 3 years. 7 times she'd been sent to work for families or farms that promised fair treatment. 7 times she'd been sent away, sometimes after weeks, sometimes after just days, because her deafness made her too difficult, too much trouble, or not worth the effort. The agency that placed her took a cut of her wages, which meant she'd spent 3 years working brutally hard for almost nothing, moving from place to place with no stability, no home, and no hope that anything would ever change. The last farm in Pennsylvania had been the worst. The family had worked her 16 hours a day, communicated through pointing and shoving, fed her scraps, and housed her in a drafty shed with the tools. When she'd tried to leave, they'd claimed she owed them money for room and board, and threatened to have her arrested if she didn't work off the debt. It had taken intervention from a visiting minister who understood sign language to free her. He'd contacted the agency, which had grudgingly found her this placement in Montana, so far from civilization that no one else wanted it. The agency's letter to her had been blunt. "This is your last chance. If this doesn't work, we wash our hands of you. You'll be on your own." Emma stole glances at Jacob as the wagon rolled on. His face was impassive, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. His hands held the reins with easy competence, guiding the horse around ruts and stones without conscious thought. Everything about him spoke of capability and self-sufficiency, the kind of man who'd carved out existence in this harsh land through sheer will and endless work. She wondered what had made him learn sign language. The agency had sworn they hadn't told him about her deafness, wanting to surprise him with a capable worker before revealing her disability. Yet he'd known, he'd prepared, he'd spent time learning to communicate with her when he could have simply sent her back the moment she arrived. After 30 minutes, Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop near a creek that cut through a stand of cottonwood trees. He climbed down and gestured for Emma to follow. She descended carefully, her legs stiff from sitting, and watched as he led the horse to drink. Then he turned to her and began to sign. "We need to talk plainly," his hands said. "The ranch is hard work, harder than anything you've probably done before. I need someone who can help with horses, mend fences, assist during calving season, and handle 100 other tasks that come up. Can you do this work? Emma straightened her spine and signed back. I can do any work you show me. I'm not afraid of hard labor. I'm only afraid of being sent away without a real chance to prove myself. Jacob studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I won't send you away unless you refuse to work or cause trouble. But you need to understand, this isn't a charity arrangement. I'm not hiring you because I feel sorry for you. I'm hiring you because I need help, and the agency said you're a hard worker. If that's true, we'll get along fine. If it's not, we'll both be disappointed. It's true, Emma signed emphatically. I've been working since I was 8 years old. Farms, households, everywhere they'd send me. The work was never the problem. The problem was always that people couldn't be bothered to figure out how to communicate with me. They'd get frustrated, decide I was stupid or stubborn, and send me back. I don't think you're stupid, Jacob signed. Stupid people don't survive what you've clearly survived. And as for communication, we'll figure it out together. My sign language is rough, but it will improve. You'll need to be patient with me the same way I'll be patient with you. Something in Emma's chest loosened. A knot of tension she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. She signed, Why did you learn? You could have just sent me back when I arrived. Jacob was quiet for a moment, his hands still. When he finally signed again, his movements were slower, more careful. My wife Margaret died 7 years ago. Before she died, she made me promise something. She said, Jacob, you're too quick to judge people by what you see on the surface. Promise me you'll look deeper. Promise me you'll give people chances even when it's not convenient. I promised her. I don't break promises to Margaret. Emma felt tears prickling her eyes again, but blinked them back. She'd cried enough at the station. Instead, she signed, Your wife sounds like she was a good person. The best person I've ever known, Jacob signed. Now let's get back on the road. I want you to see the ranch before dark. They traveled the remaining distance in companionable silence, but it felt different now, less like two strangers forced together, more like two people who'd begun to understand each other. Emma watched the landscape change as they climbed higher into the foothills. The ranch, when it finally came into view, took her breath away. The main house was modest, a 2-story structure built from logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see curtains in the windows, signs that someone maintained the place with care. Behind the house stood a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and corrals where horses moved lazily in the afternoon sun. Beyond that, the land rolled away in waves of grass and scattered trees, stretching toward mountains that rose like sentinels against the sky. It's beautiful, Emma signed when Jacob helped her down from the wagon. It's home, he signed back. Come, I'll show you where you'll stay. He led her to one of the smaller outbuildings, a cabin that had clearly been used for storage until recently. Someone had cleaned it out, swept it clean, and installed a simple cot, a small stove, a table with 1 chair and shelves for belongings. A window faced east, offering a view of the sunrise. Wildflowers in a jar sat on the table, a touch of welcome that made Emma's throat tight. It's not much, Jacob signed. But it's yours, private. You'll take your meals at the main house with me and the hands. But this is your space. No one will bother you here. Emma set down her satchel and turned in a slow circle, taking in the small cabin. She'd slept in worse places, much worse. The drafty shed in Pennsylvania, the corner of a kitchen behind a curtain in Ohio, a barn loft in Illinois where rats had run across her blanket at night. This was a palace by comparison, clean, dry, and hers. Thank you, she signed. This is more than enough. Unpack and wash up, Jacob signed. Supper is at 6. I'll come get you so you can meet Pete and Sam. They're the 2 hands who live here year-round. They were at the station today. Emma remembered the big man who'd laughed the loudest and another man who'd stood quietly at the back of the crowd. Her stomach knotted with anxiety about facing them again, but she nodded. After Jacob left, Emma sat on the cot and allowed herself a moment to breathe. The cabin was silent, but then her world was always silent. What mattered was that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. Not comfortable yet, not confident that this would last, but safe enough to hope. She opened her satchel and removed her few belongings. 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush, a small Bible her mother had given her before dying when Emma was 10, and a leather-bound journal filled with her thoughts written in careful script. At the bottom of the satchel lay the item she treasured most, a photograph of her parents taken before she was born. She'd never heard their voices, never known what her mother's laughter sounded like or her father's words of comfort. But she kept their image close, a reminder that once someone had loved her. She placed the photograph on the shelf beside the wildflowers and began to unpack. At 10 minutes before 6, Jacob appeared at her door. Together, they walked to the main house where lamplight glowed warm against the gathering dusk. Inside, the kitchen was spacious and clean, with a large table that could seat 8. 2 men stood near the stove. Pete, the big man who'd laughed, and another man of medium height with Asian features and kind eyes. This must be Sam. Both men looked uncomfortable when Emma entered, shuffling their feet and avoiding direct eye contact. Jacob signed something to Emma, then spoke aloud to the men. Emma can read lips somewhat, but it's easier if you face her directly when you speak and don't cover your mouth. Better yet, learn some basic signs. I'll teach you. Pete cleared his throat. Miss Sullivan, I want to apologize for my behavior at the station. It was cruel and uncalled for. I'm sorry. Emma could read the words on his lips, could see the genuine remorse in his face. She nodded acceptance, then looked at Jacob. Unsure how to respond without signing, Jacob signed to her. You can speak if you want, or I can translate your signs. Emma rarely used her voice. She'd been mocked too many times for how it sounded. The way deaf people's speech often sounds, when they've never heard the words they're forming. But something about this moment felt important, like a bridge she needed to cross. She gathered her courage and spoke aloud, the words awkward and uncertain. Thank you. Apology accepted. Her voice sounded strange, even to her own limited awareness of it, flat in some places, too loud in others. But none of the men laughed or smirked. Pete nodded respectfully, and Sam smiled warmly. Sam stepped forward and signed something, clumsy and uncertain, but recognizable. Hello, welcome. Emma's face lit up with surprise and delight. She signed back. You know sign language? Sam shook his head and spoke carefully, facing her so she could read his lips, only a little. In San Francisco, I worked with a deaf man at the docks. He taught me a few words. I'm very rusty, but I'll try to remember. Over supper, beef stew with fresh bread that Jacob had clearly prepared himself, Emma began to relax. The men didn't pepper her with questions or treat her like a curiosity. Instead, they talked about the ranch work ahead, the weather predictions for winter, the cattle that would need to be moved to lower pastures soon. Jacob translated when necessary, but increasingly he involved Emma by asking her opinion through signs, making her part of the conversation rather than an observer. After the meal, as Emma helped clear the table, Pete approached her carefully. He held out his hands and formed clumsy signs that she recognized as, I want to learn. Will you teach me? Emma looked at this large, rough man who'd humiliated her hours earlier and saw genuine desire to make amends. She signed back slowly, knowing he wouldn't understand, then pointed to herself, then to him, then made a gesture of teaching. Pete's face broke into a relieved smile. That night, back in her cabin, Emma wrote in her journal by candlelight, I think this might be different. I think they might actually see me as a person, not a burden. Mr. Calloway learned sign language before I even arrived. Pete apologized and wants to learn too. Sam already knows a few signs. Maybe this is the place I've been searching for. Maybe this is where I can finally stop running and start belonging. Please God, let this be the one that lasts. She blew out the candle and lay in the darkness, listening to sounds she couldn't hear but could sense, the wind moving through the pine trees, the distant movement of horses in the corral, the settling of the cabin around her. For the first time in 3 years, Emma Sullivan fell asleep without fear tightening her chest. Tomorrow would bring the real test, the actual work, The challenges of learning a new place, the possibility that she'd fail or that they'd decide she wasn't worth the trouble after all. But tonight, in this small cabin on a Montana ranch, she allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. In the main house, Jacob sat alone at the kitchen table, a book of sign language open before him. He practiced hand shapes and movements, committing them to memory the same way he'd once memorized brands and cattle prices. Margaret would have approved of this, he thought. She'd always pushed him to be better, kinder, more open to people who didn't fit the usual molds. He thought about the terrified girl who'd stepped off that stagecoach, the way she'd braced herself for rejection and mockery. He thought about her tears when he'd signed to her, about how little kindness she must have received in her life if basic courtesy could move her so deeply. The frontier had no patience for weakness, no room for those who couldn't pull their weight. But Jacob had learned something in his 63 years. Strength came in forms most people never recognized. He'd seen small women outlast large men through sheer determination. He'd seen quiet patience achieve what loud force couldn't. He'd learned that the person everyone dismissed might be the one who surprised you most. Emma Sullivan was small, deaf, and scared, but she'd survived years of exploitation and rejection without breaking. She'd crossed a continent alone to take a chance on a place she'd never seen. She'd stood with dignity while men mocked her, held her ground when everything told her to run. That took strength. Maybe more strength than breaking horses or wrestling cattle. Tomorrow, he'd find out if she could do the work. Tomorrow, he'd discover if his instinct to give her a chance was wisdom or foolishness. But tonight, he felt certain Margaret would have approved. He closed the sign language book and headed upstairs to bed, pausing at the window to look out across his ranch. Somewhere in the darkness, in a small cabin, a deaf girl slept peacefully for the first time in years. It was a small thing, perhaps, but small things, Jacob had learned, sometimes mattered most. The test of Emma Sullivan's worth would come soon enough. For now she was here, she was safe, and she had a chance. That would have to be enough. Dawn broke cold over the Circle C ranch, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Emma woke to darkness, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. She dressed quickly in the chill air, pulling on her worn work dress and boots, then stepped outside to find the ranch already stirring to life. Jacob emerged from the main house, carrying a lantern, with Pete and Sam close behind. When he saw Emma standing by her cabin, he gestured for her to join them at the barn. The morning air bit at her cheeks as she hurried across the yard, her breath forming clouds she couldn't see in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside the barn, lantern light cast long shadows across the stalls. 6 horses stood waiting, and Emma could feel their warmth, smell the hay and leather and animal musk that filled the space. Jacob handed her a pitchfork and demonstrated what he wanted, mucking out the stalls, laying fresh hay, checking water troughs. Simple work, but necessary. Emma nodded and got to work. She'd mucked plenty of stalls before, knew the rhythm of it: lift, toss, spread, repeat. The pitchfork was heavy and the work was hard, but she attacked it with determination, wanting to prove from the first morning that she could pull her weight. Pete worked 2 stalls over, and she noticed him glancing at her periodically, watching to see how she handled the task. She kept her head down and worked faster, ignoring the burning in her shoulders and the blisters already forming on her palms. By the time Jacob returned an hour later, she'd finished 3 stalls and was starting on a 4th. He inspected her work, running his hand along the fresh hay, checking the corners where lazy workers cut corners. Then he signed, "Good work. Take a break. Breakfast in 10 minutes." Emma wanted to refuse the break, wanted to finish all 6 stalls before stopping. But she recognized this was also a test, whether she'd follow instructions or push herself into exhaustion on the first day. She set down the pitchfork and followed the men to the house. Breakfast was hearty: eggs, bacon, biscuits with gravy, and coffee so strong it made Emma's eyes water. Jacob had set a place for her at the table, not off to the side or separate, but right there with the men. It was a small gesture that meant everything. Over breakfast, Jacob outlined the day's work. They needed to ride out to the north pasture to check on a section of fence that might have been damaged in recent storms. It was a 3-hour ride there and back, plus however long the repairs took. He looked at Emma and signed, "Can you ride?" Emma hesitated, then signed honestly, "I've ridden farm horses. Nothing fast. I'm not skilled." "Honesty is good," Jacob signed back. "I'll give you Daisy. She's older, steady, won't give you trouble. We'll go slow." An hour later, Emma sat atop a placid mare with a greying muzzle, her hands gripping the saddle horn perhaps more tightly than necessary. Daisy seemed supremely uninterested in going anywhere quickly, which suited Emma fine. They set out across the ranch, Jacob leading on his bay gelding, Pete and Sam flanking, and Emma bringing up the rear on patient Daisy. The ride took them through terrain that shifted from rolling grassland to rocky hillsides dotted with pine. Emma had never seen country like this, so vast, so wild, so utterly different from the cramped farms of Pennsylvania. Hawks circled overhead in currents she couldn't feel. Deer bounded away from their approach in leaps that seemed to defy gravity. The mountains rose in the distance like ancient gods watching over their domain. Despite her nervousness about the riding, Emma found herself captivated. This was why people came west, she realized. Not just for land or opportunity, but for this, for space that seemed endless, for beauty that took your breath, for the feeling that maybe, just maybe, you could remake yourself into someone new. When they reached the north fence line, the damage was worse than expected. A fallen tree had taken down 30 feet of fencing, scattering posts and tangling wire. Jacob surveyed the destruction with a grim expression, then signed to Emma, "This will take most of the day. Can you help?" Emma slid down from Daisy, less gracefully than she would have liked, and nodded emphatically. The men set to work, and Emma watched carefully to understand what needed to be done. Pete and Sam used axes to clear the fallen tree and cut it into manageable sections. Jacob began extracting the damaged posts and wire. Emma saw her opportunity and moved to help him, gripping a tangled section of wire and beginning to carefully unwind it from around a splintered post. The wire was sharp and unforgiving, biting into her hands even through her attempts to be careful. Within minutes, small cuts crisscrossed her palms, blood mixing with dirt and rust. But she didn't stop. She worked methodically, freeing post after post, coiling the salvageable wire, stacking the ruined sections separately. Jacob noticed her bleeding hands and stopped her, concern evident on his weathered face. He signed, "You're hurt, stop." Emma signed back firmly, "Small cuts. I've had worse. I can keep working." "At least wrap your hands," Jacob signed, pulling a bandana from his pocket and tearing it into strips. He bound her palms with surprising gentleness for such rough hands, then signed, "Pride is good, stupidity is not. Know the difference." It wasn't a reprimand exactly, more like advice from someone who'd learned this lesson the hard way. Emma nodded and returned to work, the makeshift bandages helping somewhat. By midday, they'd cleared the debris and were ready to start the real work, setting new posts, stretching wire, rebuilding the fence that kept the cattle contained and predators out. This was skilled labor that required strength, coordination, and experience. Emma had none of these things, but she had determination and the ability to follow instructions. Jacob showed her how to hold the post steady while he drove it into the ground with a heavy sledgehammer. The impact jarred through her arms with each strike, rattling her teeth, but she held firm. Post after post she steadied while he hammered, her arms screaming in protest, her body drenched in sweat despite the cool mountain air. Pete and Sam worked on stretching and attaching the wire. Dangerous work that required strength and care. Emma watched during breaks, learning by observation, filing away knowledge for later use. She noticed how they communicated through gesture and expression as much as words, pointing, nodding, demonstrating with their hands. It was almost like a crude version of sign language, this vocabulary of physical communication that working men developed. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion began to overwhelm Emma's determination. Her arms felt like lead weights, her hands throbbed beneath the bloody bandages. Her legs trembled from the unaccustomed riding and the constant standing and bracing. But she refused to quit, refused to be the weak link that confirmed everyone's initial judgment of her. During a water break, Sam approached her. He moved slowly, carefully, making sure she could see him coming, a courtesy that showed he was thinking about her deafness rather than treating it as something to ignore. He signed clumsily, "You work hard, good." Emma managed a tired smile and signed back, "Thank you." "Still learning," Sam nodded, then did something unexpected. He took her hands, gently asking permission with his eyes first, and examined the bandages. They were soaked through with blood and dirt. He shook his head disapprovingly, then pulled clean cloth from his saddlebag and rewrapped her hands properly, with the care of someone who treated plenty of injuries. When he finished, he spoke slowly so she could read his lips. "My father always said, work hard, but take care of your tools. Your hands are your tools. Can't work if they're too damaged." It was practical advice delivered with kindness, and it touched something in Emma's chest. She nodded seriously, committing the wisdom to memory. By the time they finished the fence repairs, the sun was sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The rebuilt fence stood strong, not pretty, but functional, which was all that mattered on a ranch. They'd done a full day's work, maybe more, and every person there had contributed. As they prepared to ride back, Jacob gathered them together. He signed to Emma while speaking aloud so everyone understood, "Good work today. All of you. Emma, you kept pace with men who've been doing this for years." "That's not easy," Pete added, his voice gruff but sincere. "Most city folk would have quit by noon, man or woman. You've got grit, Miss Sullivan." Emma felt pride swell in her chest, not the defensive pride of someone trying to prove they're not worthless, but the genuine satisfaction of having done hard work and done it well. She signed to Jacob, "Thank you for the chance to prove myself." "You proved nothing yet," Jacob signed back, but there was the ghost of a smile on his face. This was one day. Ranch work is every day, all year, no matter the weather or how you feel. Ask me again in a month if you've proven yourself. The ride back to the ranch passed in a blur of exhaustion. Emma swayed in the saddle, barely conscious, trusting Daisy to follow the other horses. When they finally reached the barn, she nearly fell trying to dismount, caught only by Pete's quick reflexes. "Steady there," he said, helping her find her feet. "First day's always the hardest. Gets easier." "Well, not easier, but you get tougher." After the horses were tended and fed, Emma stumbled to her cabin and collapsed on the cot without bothering to undress. Every muscle screamed. Her hands were on fire. Her body felt like it had been used as a fence post itself. But underneath the pain was something she hadn't felt in years, the bone-deep satisfaction of honest work well done. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, gentle shaking roused her. She opened her eyes to find Jacob standing over her, concern etched in his features. He signed, "You need to eat. Can't skip meals after a day like that. Come to the house." Emma wanted to refuse, wanted nothing more than to sleep for a week, but she recognized the sense in his words. She dragged herself upright and followed him across the darkening yard. In the kitchen, a simple meal waited. Leftover stew reheated, fresh bread, and strong tea. The men ate quietly, the exhaustion of the long day evident in their slumped shoulders and heavy movements. Emma forced herself to eat, despite her lack of appetite, knowing she'd need the energy for tomorrow. After the meal, as Emma prepared to return to her cabin, Jacob stopped her. He signed, "Show me your hands." Reluctantly, Emma held out her palms. The bandages were crusted with dried blood, and she knew the wounds underneath weren't pretty. Jacob examined them with a healer's eye, then retrieved a tin of salve from a shelf and carefully cleaned and dressed each cut properly. As he worked, Emma studied his face, the deep lines carved by weather and time, the grey threading through his hair, the competent gentleness of his scarred hands tending her injuries. He was a hard man, made hard by a hard land, but there was kindness in him too, buried deep but real. When he finished, he signed, "You did well today. Better than I expected, but don't push so hard you break yourself. A broken tool is useless. I'm not a tool, Emma signed back, a flash of defiance in her eyes. No, Jacob agreed. You're a person, which means you're more valuable than a tool, but also more fragile. Tools I can replace. People I cannot. Remember that tomorrow when you're tempted to work through injury. Emma nodded, chastened but also oddly moved by his concern. She signed, Why are you so kind to me? The agency said no one else would take me. They said you were my last chance. I expected you to work me hard and keep me at arm's length. But you learned my language. You defend me. You tend my wounds. Why? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his hands still. When he finally signed, his movements were slow and deliberate, because someone was kind to me once when I needed it most. Because Margaret taught me that strength without compassion is just cruelty. Because I'm tired of living in a world where people are judged by what they lack instead of what they offer. Because you remind me that courage comes in many forms. And sometimes the bravest person is the one who keeps going, even when every door has been slammed in their face. He paused, then added, and because when I look at you, I see someone who refuses to let the world's judgment define her worth. That's rare. That's valuable. That deserves respect. Emma felt tears threatening again. She seemed to cry more here in 2 days than she had in the previous 2 years, but she blinked them back. Instead, she signed simply, Thank you. I won't let you down. I know, Jacob signed. Now go sleep. Morning comes early on a ranch. Emma walked back to her cabin under a sky brilliant with stars she couldn't name. Her body ached in 1,000 places. Her hands throbbed. Her muscles would be screaming come morning. But inside her chest, something warm and bright had taken root, the first tentative shoots of belonging. She had survived her first real day on the Circle C ranch. She had worked alongside men who'd doubted her and earned their grudging respect. She had proven, if only to herself, that she was more than the sum of her limitations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to fail or succeed. But tonight, Emma Sullivan allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place where she could stop running and start living. In the main house, Jacob sat alone with his evening coffee, turning over the day in his mind. The girl was tougher than she looked, tougher than he'd expected, honestly. She'd kept pace with grown men doing hard labor, never complained, never quit even when it must have been agony. But toughness alone wouldn't be enough. Ranch life required more than the ability to endure pain. It required skill, judgment, the kind of deep knowledge that only came from years of experience. Could she learn fast enough? Could she adapt to the 1,000 different challenges that would come her way? He didn't know yet. But he knew this. She deserved the chance to try, and he would give her that chance for as long as she was willing to work for it. Tomorrow they'd start teaching her the subtler skills, how to read animal behavior, how to spot illness in livestock, how to anticipate problems before they became crises. Tomorrow the real education would begin, but tonight, both teacher and student slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the thoroughly exhausted, unaware that their partnership would soon face challenges far greater than fence repairs and long rides. Challenges that would test not just Emma's physical capabilities, but the very foundations of what the community believed about worth, ability, and the true meaning of strength. 3 weeks passed, in a blur of exhausting work and steady learning. Emma's hands developed calluses thick enough to handle wire without wincing. Her arms grew stronger from lifting hay bales and wielding tools. Her seat in the saddle improved until Daisy responded to her cues without hesitation. She learned to read the signs that Jacob pointed out, the way a horse held its ears to signal mood, the subtle lameness that meant a stone in the hoof, the shift in cattle behavior that indicated a predator nearby. Each evening after supper, Jacob spent an hour teaching Pete and Sam basic sign language. Pete approached it with the determination he brought to everything, practicing signs until his thick fingers could form the shapes with reasonable accuracy. Sam picked it up more naturally, his hands already accustomed to precise movements from years of detailed work. Within 2 weeks, they could hold simple conversations with Emma without Jacob needing to translate every word. The transformation in the ranch's atmosphere was subtle but profound. Where once Emma had braced herself for mockery or dismissal, she now moved through her days with growing confidence. Pete started leaving her notes in the morning, crude but effective drawings showing which tasks needed attention, accompanied by the simple signs he'd learned. Sam taught her the Chinese characters for basic words, delighted when she mastered them quickly and remembered them perfectly. But it was Jacob who invested the most in her education. He took her with him on rounds of the property, teaching her to see what he saw, not just the obvious surface, but the deeper patterns that told stories about weather, animal health, and the land itself. He showed her how to predict storms by watching cloud formations and animal behavior, how to identify medicinal plants that could treat common livestock ailments, how to read tracks and know whether they were hours old or days old. A good rancher, he signed one afternoon as they sat on a ridge overlooking the valley, doesn't just react to problems. They anticipate them. They read the signs nature provides and prepare accordingly. Emma absorbed everything with hungry intensity. For the first time in her life, someone was investing knowledge in her rather than simply extracting labor. She filled her journal each night with observations, drawings, notes about everything Jacob taught her. The journal that had once held only her private sorrows now documented her growing expertise. October arrived with the first hard frost. The aspen leaves turned gold, seemingly overnight, and the morning air carried the sharp bite that promised winter's approach. Jacob began preparing the ranch for the brutal Montana cold that would soon descend, stocking firewood, checking buildings for drafts, planning which pastures would serve as winter range for the cattle. On the morning of October 15th, Emma woke to a subtle wrongness she couldn't immediately identify. The air felt heavy, pressed down by something ominous. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find the sky a strange yellowish gray, the clouds moving fast and low. Every instinct Jacob had taught her screamed warning. She ran to the main house and found Jacob already standing on the porch, staring at the sky with an expression of deep concern. When he saw her, he signed rapidly, "Storm coming, bad one. We need to move the cattle from the high pasture to the lower range before it hits, or we'll lose them." Pete and Sam emerged from the bunkhouse, and Jacob quickly gave orders. They would ride out immediately, all 4 of them, to push the cattle down from the exposed highland pasture to the sheltered valley near the ranch buildings. It was a 2-hour ride to reach the herd, and Jacob estimated they had maybe 4 hours before the storm arrived in full force. 4 hours if we're lucky, Pete muttered. Eyeing the sky, they saddled the horses in record time. Emma's hands shook slightly as she cinched Daisy's saddle, not from fear of the work, but from the weight of responsibility. This wasn't fence repair or routine chores. This was critical work, where failure meant dead cattle and financial disaster for the ranch. Jacob must have seen her anxiety because he signed, "You can do this. Trust your training. Trust your horse. Stay alert and stay safe." They rode out at a pace faster than Emma had yet attempted, the horses sensing their urgency. The wind picked up as they climbed into the foothills, carrying the scent of snow and something electric that made the hair on Emma's arms stand up. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Emma was grateful for the heavy coat Jacob had insisted she wear. They reached the high pasture to find the cattle scattered across the grassland, grazing peacefully, oblivious to the danger building above them. There were perhaps 80 head, a significant portion of the Circle C's herd. Getting them moving and keeping them together during the descent would require coordination and skill. Jacob gathered them together and used a combination of signs and gestures to lay out the plan. Pete and Sam would flank the herd, keeping stragglers from breaking away. Jacob would lead from the front, guiding them toward the correct trail down the mountain. Emma would ride behind, pushing from the rear, watching for any cattle that tried to turn back. "Don't let them scatter," Jacob signed to Emma. "If they break and run in this terrain, We'll never find them all before the storm hits. Keep them bunched, keep them moving forward. Can you do this? Emma nodded, her jaw set with determination. I can do this. They spread out into position, and Jacob gave a whistle that Emma felt more than heard, a vibration in the air, a signal that set everything in motion. The cattle began moving, reluctantly at first, then with growing momentum as the experienced ranch horses worked them expertly. Emma had never done anything like this. She'd helped move small groups of cows between nearby pastures, but this was different. A large herd, difficult terrain, and a deadline imposed by nature's indifference. Daisy seemed to understand what was needed, moving without constant guidance, responding to the cattle's movements with the wisdom of a horse who'd done this hundreds of times. The descent began smoothly. The cattle flowed down the trail like a slow river, the horses and riders channeling their movement. But halfway down, things began to go wrong. The storm arrived earlier than expected. One moment they were working under threatening clouds. The next, the sky opened up with sleet that stung exposed skin and made the rocky trail treacherous. Visibility dropped to mere yards. The cattle grew agitated, wanting to stop, to turn back, to scatter to whatever shelter they could find. Emma felt Daisy's footing slip on the ice-slicked rocks. She gripped the saddle horn, trusting the horse to find purchase, her heart hammering as they recovered balance inches from a drop-off. Around her, she could barely see the dark shapes of cattle. Could only trust they were still there, still moving in roughly the right direction. A calf broke from the herd, panicking, running blindly toward a steep slope. Emma saw it happen through the curtain of sleet and reacted on instinct. She urged Daisy forward, cutting off the calf's escape route, turning it back toward the herd. But in doing so, she'd left a gap in the rear position, and half a dozen cattle took advantage, breaking away and heading back up the mountain. Emma's mind raced. She could go after them, but that would leave the main herd's rear completely unguarded, allowing more to escape. Or she could maintain position and hope Jacob and the others didn't notice the loss until they'd secured the main group. Neither option was good, but she had to choose. She made her decision in seconds. She turned Daisy sharply and went after the escapees. The mare responded immediately, surging up the slick trail with sure-footed courage that Emma could only marvel at. The runaway cattle were already 50 yards up the slope, and the gap was widening. Emma pushed Daisy harder than she'd ever dared, trusting the horse's judgment, feeling the powerful muscles working beneath her. Sleet pelted her face, making it hard to see. The wind howled. She could feel it shoving at her, trying to push her from the saddle. But she kept going, kept pushing, until Daisy drew alongside the lead cow. She'd watched Pete and Sam do this dozens of times, using the horse to pressure cattle into turning, using position and movement to guide without force. She tried to replicate it now, and somehow, miraculously, it worked. The lead cow turned, and the others followed, allowing Emma to push them back down the trail toward where the main herd should be. But in the whiteout conditions, she'd lost her bearings. The trail looked different, or maybe she wasn't on the trail at all. Panic flickered in her chest. She was lost, the cattle were lost, and the storm was getting worse by the minute. Then she felt something, a vibration through Daisy's body that she recognized as a whinny. Another horse nearby. She strained her eyes through the sleet and saw a dark shape materialize. Sam, on his sturdy gelding, riding toward her with clear relief on his face. He gestured emphatically. "Follow me." Emma fell in behind him, keeping the recovered cattle between them. And Sam led them back to the main herd with the confidence of someone who knew this land in any weather. The rest of the descent passed in a nightmare blur of cold, exhaustion, and constant vigilance. By the time they finally pushed the last cow into the sheltered valley pasture near the ranch buildings, Emma was so cold she couldn't feel her hands, so tired she swayed in the saddle, and so wet she thought she might never be dry again, but they'd done it. All 80 head accounted for, safe in the valley where the terrain would protect them from the worst of the storm. Jacob counted them twice to be sure, then gathered his small crew. Even through her exhaustion, Emma could read the approval in his expression. He signed, "Good work, all of you. Emma, you made a hard call and made it right. You saved those cattle and didn't let ego get in the way of asking Sam for help finding your way back. That's wisdom." In the barn, as they tended to the horses, rubbing them down, checking for injuries, ensuring they had food and water after their ordeal, Pete approached Emma. He signed with his characteristic bluntness. "You scared me when you took off after those strays. Thought you were going to get yourself killed. But you handled it. Handled it like someone who's been ranching for years, not weeks. I was wrong about you. Wrong from the first moment. You belong here." It was the closest thing to an emotional speech Emma had ever seen from Pete, and it meant more than he probably realized. She signed back. "Thank you for giving me a second chance after the station." "Hell," Pete signed with a grin. "I'm on my 4th or 5th chance with the boss. Everyone deserves at least 2. That evening, the 4 of them sat around the kitchen table with bowls of hot stew, listening to the storm rage outside. The windows rattled in their frames. The wind screamed like a living thing. But inside, the kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the comfortable silence of people who'd worked hard together and succeeded. Jacob signed to Emma. "Margaret would have liked you. She always said the measure of a person wasn't how they handled easy times, but how they responded when things got hard. Today got hard, and you didn't freeze, didn't panic, didn't quit. You thought fast and acted decisively. That's what ranching requires." Emma signed back. "I was terrified. I thought I'd lost them forever." "Being scared doesn't matter," Jacob signed. "Acting despite the fear, that's what matters. Today you became a real ranch hand. Not someone we're training, not a charity case we're tolerating, but a real member of this operation who can be counted on when it matters most." Later, alone in her cabin, Emma peeled off her wet clothes and found bruises she didn't remember earning, scrapes she hadn't felt during the crisis. Her body would ache tomorrow in new and interesting ways. But as she wrapped herself in blankets and listened to the storm without hearing it, she felt something she'd never experienced before. Pride. Not the defensive pride of someone proving they weren't worthless, but the genuine satisfaction of having been tested and having risen to meet the challenge. She'd made mistakes today, lost her position, lost her bearings, had to be rescued by Sam, but she'd also made quick decisions that saved valuable livestock. She'd kept her head in a crisis. She'd proven she could be counted on. In her journal by candlelight she wrote, "Today I stopped being Emma Sullivan, the deaf girl who might work out. Today I became Emma Sullivan, ranch hand. I belong here, not because they pity me, not because they're giving me charity, but because I've earned my place through work and courage. This is my home now. This is my family, and I will never take that for granted." Outside, the storm continued to howl through the Montana night. But inside the Circle C ranch, in the main house where Jacob sat reading by lamplight, in the bunkhouse where Pete and Sam played cards, in the small cabin where Emma wrote in her journal, there was warmth, safety, and the profound satisfaction of people who'd faced a challenge together and prevailed. The real test was still to come, though none of them knew it yet. The storm outside was temporary, but another storm was building. A human storm of prejudice, misunderstanding, and resistance to change that would challenge not just Emma's place on the ranch, but the very idea that someone like her could ever truly belong in their world. But that storm would have to wait. Tonight, exhausted and triumphant, they slept the sleep of the righteous, unaware that their hardest battles still lay ahead. November brought the first real snow. Not the sleety mix they'd endured during the cattle drive, but thick, heavy flakes that transformed the landscape into something from a winter fairy tale. The ranch settled into its cold weather rhythm, with work shifting from outdoor maintenance to barn tasks, equipment repair, and the constant job of ensuring the livestock had food and water despite the freezing temperatures. Emma had been at the Circle C for nearly 2 months, and the transformation was remarkable. She moved through her tasks with confidence, born of repetition and success. Her once soft hands were now as calloused as any working person's. Her thin frame had filled out slightly from regular, substantial meals. Most importantly, the perpetual wariness in her eyes had faded, replaced by the quiet contentment of someone who'd finally found their place. The Saturday before Thanksgiving, Jacob announced they needed to make a supply run into Copper Ridge. Winter supplies required careful planning, enough flour, sugar, salt, and other staples to last through potential weeks of being snowed in. Medical supplies, lamp oil, ammunition, and 100 other items that couldn't be improvised if they ran out. "Emma, you'll come with us," Jacob signed over breakfast. "You need proper winter clothes. What you have won't survive a Montana winter." Emma wanted to protest. She'd made do with less her entire life, but she recognized the practicality in his words. Her coat was thin, her boots were cracking, and she had no proper gloves. She nodded agreement. The ride into town took longer in the snow, but the day was clear and crisp, the kind of November morning where the cold bit at your cheeks, but the sun glittered off the snow like scattered diamonds. Pete and Sam came along. Supply runs required multiple wagons to haul everything back. They arrived in Copper Ridge just before noon, and Emma felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She hadn't been back to town since that first humiliating day at the station. The memory of the laughter, the mockery, still stung despite everything she'd accomplished since. "Hold your head high," Jacob signed before they entered the general store. "You've earned the right to be here as much as anyone." The general store was crowded with other ranchers and townspeople doing their own winter preparation shopping. Conversation died when Jacob's group entered. Emma felt the weight of their stares, saw the whispers behind hands, the pointing that people didn't bother to hide. Martha Henderson, who ran the store with her husband George, was a formidable woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and opinions she shared freely. She looked up from the counter when they entered, her eyes landing on Emma with undisguised curiosity. "Jacob Calloway," she said loudly enough for the whole store to hear. "Is that the deaf girl you hired? The one everyone said wouldn't last a week?" The store went even quieter. Emma felt her face flush, but Jacob simply nodded calmly. "This is Emma Sullivan, my ranch hand. We need winter supplies. Here's the list." He handed Martha a piece of paper, but she barely glanced at it, her attention fixed on Emma. "Ranch hand? She doesn't look like she could handle ranch work. Looks more like a stiff wind could knock her over." "Looks deceive," Jacob said flatly. "She's proven herself more capable than half the men I've hired over the years. Now about those supplies?" But Martha wasn't finished. "It's all well and good to have Christian charity, Jacob, but running a ranch isn't a charity operation. You're getting soft in your old age, taking in strays who can't pull their weight." The words hit Emma like physical blows. She'd been called many things: burden, charity case, useless, but hearing it spoken so publicly, so casually, brought back every moment of rejection she'd ever experienced. Before Jacob could respond, Pete stepped forward, his massive frame suddenly seeming even larger in the confines of the store. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't know what you're talking about." Emma's proven herself 10 times over. She works harder than most men, complains less, and learns faster. Just last month she helped us save 80 head of cattle in a blizzard when most folks would have frozen up in fear. Sam added his voice, quieter but firm. "She's earned her place, fair and square." Martha looked taken aback by the vehemence of their defense, but she rallied quickly. "That's all well and good, but what happens when real trouble comes? When you need someone who can hear a horse screaming in distress, or a predator approaching, or another hand calling for help. Her disability puts everyone at risk." The store's other customers were watching now with open fascination, witnessing a confrontation that would fuel town gossip for weeks. Emma stood frozen, wanting to defend herself but uncertain how without Jacob to translate, not wanting to use her voice and give them more ammunition for mockery. Then something unexpected happened. A man stepped forward from the back of the store, Thomas Brennan, the town's newspaper editor and one of its more educated residents. He was in his 40s, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mrs. Henderson," he said carefully, "I've been researching an article about innovations in communication. Did you know there are entire communities of deaf people back east who live full, productive lives? Schools where deaf children learn to read and write at the same level as hearing children? The assumption that deafness equals inability is frankly outdated and ignorant." Martha bristled. "Are you calling me ignorant, Thomas Brennan?" "I'm saying your assumptions are ignorant," Thomas replied calmly. "There's a difference. We all carry assumptions based on lack of exposure or information. I certainly did until I started researching. But when Jacob Calloway, a man known throughout this territory for his practical judgment and fairness, vouches for someone's capability, perhaps we should question our assumptions rather than his decision." Martha's husband, George, who'd been watching from behind the counter, finally spoke up. "Martha, just fill their order. What Jacob does on his ranch is his business." Outnumbered and out-argued, Martha pressed her lips into a thin line and began gathering the items from Jacob's list with sharp, angry movements. The tension in the store slowly dissipated as other customers returned to their own shopping, though Emma could still feel surreptitious glances in her direction. While Martha filled the order, Thomas approached Emma directly. He moved carefully into her line of sight and spoke slowly, clearly. "Miss Sullivan, I apologize for that scene. Mrs. Henderson means well, but she's set in her thinking. Not everyone in Copper Ridge shares her views." Emma could read his lips easily. He was obviously making an effort to speak clearly for her benefit. She appreciated it, but still didn't trust her voice in public. She looked to Jacob, who translated her signs. "She says thank you for speaking up. She's used to worse." "Well, she shouldn't have to be," Thomas said firmly. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and wrote quickly, then showed it to Emma. "If you're willing, I'd like to interview you for the newspaper. Let people know your story. It might change some minds." Emma took the notebook and pencil and wrote back, "Why would you want to do that?" Thomas read her response and said aloud while she watched his lips, "Because stories change things. People fear what they don't understand, but understanding begins with stories. Your story, coming west alone, learning ranch work, proving yourself despite the odds, that's a story worth telling." Emma wrote, "Will it help or hurt Mr. Calloway? I don't want to cause him problems." Jacob had been watching this exchange, and now he signed to Emma. Let him write it. The truth is always worth telling. Before Emma could respond, the store door banged open, and 3 ranch hands from a neighboring property stomped in, shaking snow from their coats. Emma recognized 2 of them from the station that first day. They'd been among those laughing the loudest. One of them, a young man named Cooper, who had a reputation for being mouthy, spotted their group and called out, "Well, look here! It's Calloway's charity project. Tell me, old man, has she learned to pull her weight yet, or are you still carrying her?" The store went silent again. Pete and Sam stiffened, but Jacob held up a hand, stopping them. He turned to Cooper with the calm, steady gaze that had intimidated better men. "Cooper Hayes," Jacob said evenly. "Emma works for me, same as Pete and Sam. She earns her keep, and then some. If you have a problem with that, you're welcome to say it to my face. But if you insult her again, we'll have a different kind of conversation." Cooper's bravado faltered slightly under Jacob's stare, but he pushed forward. "It's not natural, is what I'm saying. A deaf girl doing man's work? What's next? Are we going to pretend everyone's the same? That there's no difference between the strong and the weak?" "No," Jacob said quietly. "We're going to stop pretending that strength only looks one way. We're going to recognize that capability comes in many forms. And we're going to judge people by their character and their actions, not by our narrow assumptions about what they can or cannot do," Sam added, his voice carrying a weight of personal experience. "Funny how people said the same things about Chinese workers. Said we were too weak, too different, couldn't do real work. Now half the railroads in this country were built by Chinese hands. Maybe the problem isn't with the people you judge, Cooper. Maybe it's with your judgment." The other customers murmured among themselves, some nodding agreement, others looking uncomfortable. Cooper, realizing he was losing the crowd, muttered something under his breath and turned away to browse the shelves. But his two companions followed, and Emma could see them whispering, glancing in her direction. Martha finished assembling their supplies with bad grace, tallying the cost with sharp pencil strokes. Jacob paid, and Pete and Sam began loading the goods into the wagons. As they prepared to leave, Thomas approached Emma one more time. "Think about the interview," he said, speaking slowly and clearly. "Not everyone in Copper Ridge is like Cooper or Mrs. Henderson. Many of us believe in judging people fairly. But change requires courage from those who are different to stand up and be counted. You've already shown tremendous courage. Consider showing a bit more." Outside, as they loaded the last of the supplies, Emma felt drained. The confrontation had stirred up all the old feelings of being judged, found wanting, dismissed as less than. But it had also shown her something new, that she had defenders now. People who would stand up for her not out of pity, but because they genuinely believed she deserved respect. On the ride back to the ranch, Jacob signed to her. "That was hard. I'm sorry you had to face that. It's nothing I haven't faced before," Emma signed back. "But before I faced it alone. Today I had you, Pete, Sam, even Mr. Brennan standing with me. That's different. That matters. Those people in town," Jacob signed, "they're scared. Not of you specifically, but of change, of having their assumptions challenged, of discovering that the world is more complex than they want it to be. That fear makes them cruel. Will it always be like this?" Emma signed. "Will I always have to prove myself over and over?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, guiding the wagon around a deep rut. Then he signed, "Probably. But each time you prove yourself, you make it easier for the next person who's different. You're not just fighting for your own acceptance. You're fighting for everyone who'll come after you. That's a burden you didn't ask for, but it's the burden pioneers always carry." Emma considered this as the wagon rolled through the snowy landscape. A pioneer. She'd never thought of herself that way. She'd just been trying to survive, to find a place where she could exist without constant rejection. But perhaps Jacob was right. Perhaps by simply refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose on her. By proving herself capable despite their doubts, she was pioneering a new way of thinking. That evening, gathered around the kitchen table for supper, Pete asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Are you going to let Brennan interview you?" Emma had been thinking about it all afternoon. She signed, "I don't know. Part of me wants to hide, to not draw more attention. But part of me thinks maybe Mr. Brennan is right. Maybe telling my story could help others understand. It could also paint a bigger target on your back," Sam signed. His signing had improved dramatically over the past weeks. "Some people don't like having their prejudices challenged. They might make things harder for you, for all of us. They're already hard," Emma signed back. "Today proved that. At least, if my story is out there, it's the truth. Right now they're making up their own stories about me, filling in blanks with their assumptions. Maybe the truth is better than their imagination." Jacob nodded slowly. "It's your decision. Whatever you choose, we'll support you. But Sam's right. There will be consequences. Some people will be moved by your story. Others will be angered by it. You need to be prepared for both." Emma sat with the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought about all the other deaf children and adults out there, facing the same dismissal and rejection she'd experienced. She thought about the families who might hire someone deaf if they just understood it didn't mean incapable. She thought about the deaf girl somewhere who might read her story and find hope. Finally, she signed, "I'll do it. I'll tell my story. Not for me, but for everyone who comes after me. So maybe the next deaf person who shows up in a place like Copper Ridge won't face what I faced. Or at least they'll know they're not alone in facing it." Pete grinned and signed, "That's our Emma, brave as they come." "Not brave," Emma signed back. "Just tired of being invisible, tired of being dismissed. If telling my story makes me visible in a way that helps others, then it's worth whatever consequences come." That night, Emma wrote in her journal, "Today I learned that standing up for yourself means standing in the open where people can see you, judge you, even attack you. It's easier to hide, to stay small, to not draw attention. But hiding doesn't change anything. Today, I decided to stop hiding. Whatever comes next, at least it will be on my terms. In the main house, Jacob sat by the fire, thinking about the confrontation in the store and Emma's decision to tell her story publicly. He knew it would bring trouble. People like Martha Henderson and Cooper Hayes would feel threatened by Emma's success, would work to undermine her credibility and by extension his judgment in hiring her. But he also knew that some fights were worth having. The fight to see people as individuals rather than categories. The fight to judge based on capability rather than assumption. The fight to create a world where a deaf girl could arrive in a frontier town and be valued for her work rather than dismissed for her difference. Margaret would have approved. She'd always pushed him toward the harder right instead of the easier wrong. This was one of those moments, and Jacob Calloway had never been a man to back down from doing what was right. Regardless of the cost, tomorrow Thomas Brennan would come to the ranch to interview Emma. The story would be published, and Copper Ridge would have to decide what kind of community it wanted to be, one that judged people by their limitations or one that celebrated them for their capabilities. The choice was theirs, but Emma Sullivan had already made her choice. She would stand in the light and let them see exactly who she was, strengths, limitations, and all. And if they still chose to reject her after seeing the truth, well, at least the rejection would be based on reality rather than ignorant assumption. That, Jacob thought as he climbed the stairs to bed, was a kind of victory all its own. Thomas Brennan arrived at the Circle C Ranch 3 days later, riding a sturdy mare and carrying a leather satchel filled with notebooks, pencils, and a genuine curiosity that set Emma more at ease than she'd expected. Jacob had set up the interview in the main house parlor, a room that was rarely used but had good light from the large windows and chairs, comfortable enough for a long conversation. Emma had spent the previous 2 days in a state of nervous anticipation, second-guessing her decision a dozen times. What if she said the wrong thing? What if her story made things worse instead of better? What if people read it and decided she was arrogant for thinking her experience mattered? But when Thomas settled into his chair, pulled out his notebook, and signed a simple greeting he'd clearly been practicing, Emma felt her anxiety ease slightly. This man was genuinely interested in understanding, not in exploiting or mocking her. "Let's start at the beginning," Thomas said, speaking slowly and clearly while Jacob sat nearby to translate signs when needed. "Tell me about your life before you came to Montana. Don't hold back. People need to understand what you overcame to get here." So Emma told her story. She told him about growing up deaf in Pennsylvania, about her mother dying when she was 10, and her father remarrying a woman who saw Emma as a burden. About being sent away at 13 to work for families who promised to care for her but treated her like an indentured servant. About the farm where she slept with the tools, the household where she was fed only scraps, the family who worked her 16 hours a day and paid her nothing. She told him about the 7 placements in 3 years, about learning to expect rejection, about the agency that treated her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be helped. She told him about the fear she'd felt stepping off that stagecoach in Copper Ridge, expecting this to be just another rejection in a long line of them. And then she told him about Jacob, about the moment he'd signed to her at the station, about the coat he'd given her, about how he'd learned her language before she'd even arrived. About Pete and Sam learning to sign, about being taught ranch skills with the same patience and respect given to any apprentice, about the cattle drive in the storm, about proving herself through work rather than words. Thomas wrote furiously, occasionally stopping to ask clarifying questions or to request that Emma slow down when her signing became rapid with emotion. Hours passed. The afternoon light shifted across the parlor floor. Coffee was brought and consumed, and slowly Emma's story took shape in Thomas's neat handwriting. When she finished, Thomas sat back and studied his notes. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "Not just your story, but what it represents. You're living proof that disability doesn't equal inability, that given opportunity and respect, people can exceed every expectation placed on them. I'm not trying to be proof of anything, Emma signed with Jacob translating. I just wanted a chance to work, to earn my keep, to belong somewhere. I'm not special. I'm just stubborn. That stubbornness, Thomas said with a slight smile, is precisely what makes your story compelling. You refuse to accept the limitations others tried to impose on you. That's not just stubbornness, that's courage. He turned to Jacob. And you, Mr. Calloway, why did you take this chance? Most ranchers would have sent her back the moment they realized she was deaf. What made you different? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and Emma could see him carefully considering his words. Finally, he spoke aloud while signing so Emma could follow. My wife Margaret taught me that the easiest judgments are usually wrong. She taught me to look deeper, to see people rather than categories. When Emma arrived, I saw someone who'd been judged her entire life and found wanting, not because she lacked capability, but because people lacked imagination. I figured if she had the courage to keep trying after so many rejections, the least I could do was give her a fair chance to prove herself. And has she? Thomas asked. She's exceeded every expectation, Jacob said simply. She's one of the best hands I've ever employed. Her deafness, which everyone assumed would be a liability, has actually made her more observant, more careful, more thoughtful in her work. She pays attention to details others miss because she can't rely on sound to alert her to problems. Thomas scribbled notes, then looked at Emma again. What do you want people to understand about deafness? If you could tell the readers of the Copperidge Herald one thing, what would it be? Emma thought carefully before signing. That deaf doesn't mean stupid, incapable, or broken. It just means we experience the world differently. We can do anything hearing people can do, we just might do it in a different way. Don't judge us by what we can't do. Judge us by what we can do when given a fair chance. Thomas wrote that down word for word, underlining it in his notebook. That's going to be my closing quote, he said. It's perfect. Before he left, Thomas asked to photograph Emma and Jacob together. He had a camera in his saddlebag, a new technology that still seemed almost magical to Emma. He posed them on the ranch house porch, Emma standing straight with quiet dignity, Jacob beside her with his hand resting on the porch rail. Both of them looking directly at the camera, without smiling but without shame either. This photograph, Thomas said as he packed his equipment, will run with the story. People will see you, not some abstract idea of a deaf person, but you, Emma Sullivan, standing on equal footing with one of the most respected ranchers in the territory. That image will say more than 1,000 words ever could. After Thomas left, Emma felt strangely exposed, as if she'd shed a protective layer and now stood vulnerable to whatever judgment would come. Jacob must have sensed her anxiety because he signed, "Second thoughts?" "Many thoughts," Emma signed back. "But I can't take it back now. The story is out there. All I can do is wait and see how people respond." The wait was shorter than expected. The Copper Ridge Herald published weekly, and Thomas's story ran in the very next issue under the headline, "Against All Odds, How One Deaf Girl is Changing What It Means to Be Capable." The article was remarkable in its detail and compassion. Thomas had woven Emma's personal story together with broader observations about prejudice, capability, and the changing nature of the frontier. He'd included Jacob's quotes about judging people by their actions rather than assumptions. He'd ended with Emma's powerful statement about being judged by capability rather than limitation. And there, taking up a quarter of the front page, was the photograph of Emma and Jacob on the ranch house porch, a visual argument that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. The response was immediate and divided. Some readers were moved by Emma's story. Women in town began discussing it at quilting circles and church gatherings. Several approached Jacob during his next trip to town to express admiration for Emma's determination and his willingness to give her a chance. A few even asked if he thought a deaf person could do other kinds of work, teaching, bookkeeping, seamstress work, planting seeds of possibility in minds that had never considered such questions before. But others reacted with anger and hostility. Martha Henderson wrote a letter to the editor claiming that Thomas had been deceived, that he'd presented a romanticized version of reality, that hiring deaf people was dangerous and irresponsible. Cooper Hayes and several other young ranch hands started spreading rumors that Emma couldn't really do the work, that Jacob was covering for her mistakes, that the whole thing was an elaborate deception designed to make them all look bad for their prejudices. The owner of the neighboring ranch, a man named William Drummond, who'd built his operation through ruthless efficiency and had little patience for anything he saw as sentiment, made his opinion known loudly at Murphy's saloon. He declared that Jacob was going soft, that running a ranch required hard men making hard decisions, and that coddling the weak would destroy the industry. "Mark my words," Drummond announced to anyone who would listen. "This experiment of Callaway's will end in disaster. You can't run a successful operation by hiring people out of pity. And when it fails, and it will fail, we'll all suffer for it because it'll encourage others to make the same mistake." Word of these reactions filtered back to the Circle C through the informal network of gossip and trade that connected all the ranches in the region. Pete heard about it during a trip to the blacksmith. Sam learned of it from a merchant in town. They brought the news back to the ranch with visible anger. "Drummond's spreading poison," Pete fumed over supper one evening. "Telling everyone you've lost your edge? That you're running the Circle C into the ground by hiring Emma. He's even suggesting other ranchers should refuse to do business with you until you come to your senses." Emma felt sick. This was exactly what she'd feared, that standing up for herself would bring trouble not just to her, but to everyone who'd supported her. She signed to Jacob, "Maybe I should leave. If my being here is causing you problems with other ranchers, stop," Jacob signed firmly. "You're not going anywhere. Drummond's opinion matters less than he thinks it does." The Circle C's reputation was built over 30 years of honest dealing and good work. One man's prejudice doesn't erase that, but what if others listen to him? Emma signed, "What if they stop doing business with you?" "I don't want to be the reason your ranch suffers," Sam interjected, his signs now smooth and confident. "You're not the reason. Their prejudice is the reason. Don't take responsibility for other people's closed minds." Despite their reassurances, Emma couldn't shake the guilt. That night, unable to sleep, she walked out to the barn where the horses stirred softly in their stalls. She found Daisy and pressed her forehead against the mare's warm neck, seeking comfort in the animal's patient presence. She didn't hear Jacob approach. Of course she didn't, but she felt the shift in the air that told her she was no longer alone. She turned to find him standing in the barn doorway, a lantern in his hand. Couldn't sleep either. He signed, setting the lantern on a post. Emma shook her head, then signed, "I keep thinking about what Mr. Drummond said. What if he's right? What if I'm a mistake? Not because I can't do the work, but because the cost of proving it is too high." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. Then he signed, "30 years ago, when I first came to this valley, people said I was making a mistake, said the land was too rough, the winters too harsh, that I'd lose everything within 2 years. They were wrong then. Drummond's wrong now." He paused, then continued, "Change always costs something, always threatens someone. Drummond isn't angry because you're deaf. He's angry because your success challenges his worldview. If you can do this work, then all his assumptions about strength and capability are wrong. That terrifies him because it means he might be wrong about other things too. So I'm supposed to just accept that people will hate me for existing?" Emma signed. "No," Jacob signed. "You're supposed to understand that their hatred isn't about you. It's about their fear. And you're supposed to keep living your life, doing your work, proving through your daily actions that capability takes many forms. Some people will never accept that, but others, the ones with open minds and generous hearts, they'll see the truth. And slowly, generation by generation, those people will outnumber the fearful ones. Emma considered his words, drawing strength from his steady conviction. She signed. "You really believe that? That things will change?" "I've lived 63 years, Jacob signed. "I've seen changes I never imagined possible. I've seen this territory transform from wilderness to civilization, seen technology develop that would seem like magic to my grandfather. Why shouldn't human understanding develop too? Why shouldn't we get better at seeing each other's worth?" "Because people like Drummond fight change," Emma signed. "Yes," Jacob agreed. "And people like you fight back by simply existing, by refusing to accept the limitations they try to impose. That's how change happens, not through grand gestures, but through the daily persistence of people who refuse to be less than they are." They stood in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over the months, two people who communicated across differences through patience, respect, and genuine regard for each other. Finally, Emma signed. "Thank you for everything, for learning my language, for defending me, for believing I was worth the trouble." "You were never trouble," Jacob signed. "You were an opportunity for me to live up to the values Margaret taught me. An opportunity for this ranch to be more than just a business. An opportunity to prove that respect and capability matter more than conformity. I should be thanking you for that opportunity." The next day brought unexpected support from an unlikely source. A messenger arrived at the ranch with a letter addressed to Jacob. It was from Helena, the territorial capital, signed by a lawyer named Elizabeth Morrison, who specialized in employment law. She'd read Thomas's article and was writing to offer her services should anyone attempt to legally challenge Emma's employment or Jacob's right to hire whom he chose. She wrote that she'd been following cases involving discrimination against workers with disabilities and saw Emma's story as an important test case that could set precedents for the entire territory. "There are more people fighting this battle than you realize," she wrote. "Your courage, both of you, inspires others to stand up against prejudice. If you face legal challenges, you won't face them alone." Jacob showed Emma the letter, and for the first time since the article had published, Emma felt hope rising again. She wasn't alone in this fight. There were others, people she'd never met, people scattered across the territory and beyond, who believed in the same principles Jacob had taught her, who believed that capability should be judged by actions, not assumptions. That evening, a delegation of 3 women from town arrived at the ranch. Emma recognized one of them, Catherine Wells, the minister's wife, a woman known for her charity work and progressive views. The other 2 were younger women Emma had seen around town but never met. Catherine spoke while Jacob translated. "Miss Sullivan, we came to tell you that not everyone in Copper Ridge shares the narrow views you've encountered. Many of us were moved by your story. We're organizing a social at the church, a gathering where you can meet people in a less hostile environment, where we can show you that you have friends in town even if you haven't met them yet." Emma was overwhelmed by the gesture, and her signs reflected that emotion as Jacob translated. "She says she's touched by your kindness." She wasn't sure if she'd made things worse by telling her story. "You made things better," Catherine said firmly. "You forced people to examine their prejudices. Some will cling to their biases, but others are questioning them. That's how communities grow, through uncomfortable conversations and people brave enough to stand up and be counted. We want you to know you're not standing alone." After the women left, Emma stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. The world felt different now, larger somehow, full of both more danger and more possibility than she'd imagined. She'd told her story. She'd made herself visible, and the response had been exactly what Jacob predicted. Some people hated her for it, but others, the ones with open minds and generous hearts, had seen the truth. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was progress. And progress, Emma was learning, was something you built one day, one conversation, one changed mind at a time. In his study, Jacob added a notation to his ranch ledger, not about cattle or supplies, but a simple observation. Emma Sullivan, hired October 1889. Best decision I've made in years. Margaret would approve. Outside, the Montana winter deepened, but inside the Circle C ranch, something warmer was growing. The beginnings of real change. The first fragile shoots of a new understanding about worth, capability, and the infinite ways humans could contribute when given the chance. The battle wasn't over. But Emma Sullivan and Jacob Calloway had allies now. And in the long war against prejudice and closed minds, allies made all the difference. December arrived with temperatures that plunged below zero and winds that howled down from the mountains with teeth sharp enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. The Circle C settled into the grinding routine of winter ranch work, breaking ice on water troughs twice daily, hauling hay to cattle that couldn't forage through the deep snow, checking constantly for signs of illness or injury in animals stressed by the cold. Emma had grown accustomed to the rhythm, though the brutal cold was unlike anything she'd experienced in Pennsylvania. Her new winter clothes, purchased with wages Jacob insisted on paying despite her protests, made the difference between discomfort and danger. Thick wool coat, line boots, gloves that actually kept her fingers warm, small luxuries that meant survival. The social that Catherine Wells had organized took place 2 weeks before Christmas. Emma had been terrified to attend, but Jacob, Pete, and Sam all accompanied her, a show of solidarity that made the evening bearable. The turnout was better than she'd expected. Perhaps 30 people, mostly women and families, gathered in the church hall with coffee, cookies, and genuine curiosity. Not everyone was friendly. A few people came only to stare, to judge, to confirm their existing prejudices. But others approached Emma with real interest, asking questions through Jacob's translation, wanting to understand what her life was like, how she'd learned ranch work, what her plans were for the future. One moment stood out. A young mother approached hesitantly, her 6-year-old daughter clutching her skirt. The woman spoke carefully, making sure Emma could read her lips. "My daughter was born deaf. The doctor told us she'd never learn anything, that we should prepare to care for her like an invalid for the rest of her life. But seeing what you've accomplished, it gives us hope. Could you meet with her? Show her that being deaf doesn't mean being helpless?" Emma knelt down to the child's level, and the little girl's eyes went wide as Emma began to sign. The child didn't know formal sign language yet, but Emma could see the recognition in her face, the understanding that here was someone like her, someone who communicated the same way she instinctively wanted to. Emma signed slowly, simply, and the child began to imitate the movements, her face lighting up with joy. The mother wept openly, and Emma knew without asking that these were tears of relief, of hope that her daughter might have a future beyond the limitations the world tried to impose. That night, Emma wrote in her journal, "Today I understood what Mr. Brennan meant about my story mattering beyond myself. That little girl saw me and saw possibility. If my existence can give even one child hope for a better future, then every hardship was worth it." But hope, Emma was learning, was a fragile thing that could be shattered by circumstance and tested by crisis. The crisis came on December 18th. During one of the worst blizzards of the season, the day had started normally enough, morning chores completed, cattle checked, everything seemingly under control. But by noon, the wind had picked up and the temperature was dropping with frightening speed. By 2 o'clock, visibility had dropped to nearly zero, and the snow was falling so thick and fast that it was like trying to see through a solid white curtain. Jacob called everyone into the main house. His face was grim as he signed and spoke simultaneously. "This is going to be bad. Maybe the worst storm we've seen in years. We need to do one more check on the cattle. Make sure they're in the sheltered valley and not scattered where they could freeze. Then we seal everything up and wait it out." They prepared quickly, dressing in every layer they owned, tying ropes between buildings so they wouldn't get lost in the whiteout conditions. The plan was simple. Jacob and Pete would check the main herd in the valley, while Sam and Emma secured the horses and checked the smaller stock closer to the ranch buildings. But plans, Emma had learned, rarely survived contact with reality. She and Sam had just finished checking the horses when Sam suddenly grabbed her arm, pointing urgently toward the ridge above the ranch. Emma squinted through the driving snow and saw what had alarmed him: dark shapes moving along the ridgeline. Cattle. A small group, maybe 10 head, had somehow gotten separated from the main herd and were up on the exposed ridge where the wind and cold would kill them within hours. Sam's face was torn with indecision. Jacob and Pete were already gone, too far away to call back. Going after the cattle in these conditions was dangerous, potentially deadly, but leaving them meant certain death for the animals and significant financial loss for the ranch. Emma made the decision quickly. She pointed to herself, then to the ridge, signing that she would go. Sam shook his head violently, signing back, too dangerous. Wait for Jacob, but Emma knew there was no time. By the time they found Jacob and came back, the cattle could be dead or scattered beyond finding. She signed firmly, "I can do this. Daisy knows the terrain. Trust me." Before Sam could stop her, Emma was running for the barn. She saddled Daisy with practiced speed, grabbed a rope and mounted up. Sam, realizing he couldn't stop her, made his own quick decision. He scrawled a note for Jacob explaining what had happened and where they'd gone, then saddled his own horse and followed Emma into the storm. The ride up to the ridge was treacherous. The wind tried to push them sideways off the trail. Snow stung Emma's face despite the scarf wrapped around it. Daisy's footing was uncertain on the ice-slicked rocks. But the mare pressed forward with the determination Emma had come to rely on, and somehow they reached the ridge, where the cattle huddled miserably against the wind. Emma could see immediately that the animals were in trouble. Their coats were already freezing, ice forming on their muzzles and backs. They were bunched together for warmth, but facing the wrong direction, unable to find the trail down to shelter. Without intervention, they would freeze where they stood. Sam pulled up beside her, and together they began the delicate work of turning the herd and pushing them toward the trail. The cattle didn't want to move, instinctively clustering together rather than trusting the humans trying to save them. Emma had to use everything Jacob had taught her: positioning, patience, reading the animal's body language, and responding accordingly. It was exhausting, dangerous work. The wind made it nearly impossible to stay in the saddle. The cold sapped strength with terrifying speed. Emma's hands were numb despite her gloves, her face burned with cold, and several times she thought she might simply freeze and fall from Daisy's back, but she kept going. She kept pushing, and slowly, agonizingly, the cattle began to move. They'd gotten perhaps halfway down the trail when disaster struck. The lead cow suddenly spooked at something, a shape in the snow, a sound Emma couldn't hear, and bolted sideways, taking 3 others with her. The herd, already nervous and disoriented, began to scatter. Sam went after the larger group, but Emma saw 2 head breaking away in the opposite direction, heading toward an area where the trail narrowed dangerously near a steep drop-off. If they went over, they were dead. And if Emma went after them and lost her way, she might be dead too. She didn't hesitate. She urged Daisy after the escaping cattle, trusting the horse to find safe footing where Emma's eyes couldn't penetrate the swirling white. They caught up to the runaways just before the drop-off, and Emma used her horse to block their path, forcing them to turn back. But in the confusion, Emma had lost her bearings. The trail, the ranch buildings, the safe path down, everything had disappeared into the uniform whiteness. She could see perhaps 10 feet in any direction, no landmarks, no reference points. Just snow and wind, and the very real possibility of dying up here in the cold. Emma felt panic rising in her chest, that old familiar terror of being helpless, of being unable to hear the sounds that might guide her. Wind direction, water running, the distant sound of human voices or animal movement. Her deafness, which had never truly been a liability in ranch work, suddenly felt like a death sentence. Then she remembered something Jacob had taught her. "Trust your horse," he'd signed. "Horses have instincts we lack. They can find their way home when we can't. Give them their head and trust." With trembling hands, Emma loosened the reins, giving Daisy control. She kept the two recovered cattle in front of her, but let the mare choose the direction. For several terrifying minutes, they moved through the white void, with no idea if they were heading toward safety or deeper into danger. Then, through the snow, Emma saw a dark shape. A building, the barn. Daisy had brought them home. Sam appeared out of the storm moments later, driving the rest of the small herd ahead of him. Together, they got all the cattle into the sheltered valley where they'd have some protection from the wind. Then they rode hard for the barn, both of them nearly frozen, both knowing how close they'd come to not making it back. In the barn, they practically fell from their horses, their bodies shaking with cold and exhaustion. Emma's fingers were so numb, she couldn't unsaddle Daisy. Sam had to help her, his own hands barely functional. They rubbed down the horses, gave them extra feed as reward for their heroism, then staggered toward the main house. Jacob and Pete had returned moments before and were in the kitchen warming up when Emma and Sam stumbled in. Covered in ice and snow, barely able to stand. The relief on Jacob's face was immediately replaced by anger, the kind of anger that comes from fear. "What were you thinking?" He signed furiously at Emma. "Going out in that storm, you could have died. Both of you could have died." Emma was too cold and exhausted to be diplomatic. She signed back. 10 head were on the ridge. Would have died. We saved them. Isn't that what ranchers do? Not at the cost of their own lives. Jacob signed. "Cattle can be replaced." "You cannot." "You would have gone after them," Emma signed stubbornly. "Don't tell me you wouldn't have." Jacob opened his mouth to argue, then closed it because she was right and they both knew it. He would have done exactly what she did, and being angry at her for doing what he would have done himself was hypocritical. His hands softened, and he signed more gently. "You're right, I would have, but that doesn't mean I'm not terrified at how close we came to losing you. Both of you," he added, looking at Sam. "The cattle." Emma signed. "Safe in the valley with the main herd," Pete answered, his signs now fluent enough to join the conversation. "You saved them. All 10 head, in conditions that would have stopped most people." Over the next hour, as Emma and Sam thawed by the fire, drinking hot coffee and eating the stew Jacob had prepared, the full story emerged. Sam explained how Emma had made the decision to go, how she'd worked the scattered cattle with skill and courage, how she'd recovered the runaways when they could have been lost or killed, how she'd trusted her horse when she couldn't trust her own senses, and how that trust had saved her life. Jacob listened to all of it, and Emma could see his expression shifting from residual fear to something else, pride perhaps, mixed with a grudging acceptance that the student he'd been teaching had truly learned the lessons he'd tried to impart. Later that evening, after the storm had locked them all inside for the night, Jacob sat down with Emma in the parlor. He signed, "What you did today was brave. Foolish maybe, but brave. You made a rancher's decision, risk against reward, calculating that the cattle's value and your skills were worth the danger. You were right. But you also need to understand something." Emma waited, watching his hands. "You're not expendable," Jacob signed. "To this ranch, to me, you matter more than any number of cattle. I need you to promise me that you'll always remember that. Your life has value beyond your labor. Don't throw it away trying to prove you're as tough as everyone else." Emma felt tears pricking her eyes, from exhaustion, from emotion, from the simple power of being told her life mattered for reasons beyond usefulness. She signed, "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just doing what needed to be done, I know," Jacob signed. "And that's what makes you a real rancher. Not someone trying to prove something, but someone who does what needs to be done because it needs doing. Just promise me you'll be careful. The world doesn't have enough people like you. I'd prefer not to lose one to a Montana blizzard," Emma promised, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind howl outside, while the fire crackled warm beside them. News of Emma's rescue of the cattle spread through the community faster than the storm that had prompted it. Thomas Brennan wrote another article, shorter this time, but powerful, describing how the deaf girl everyone said would be a liability had risked her life to save livestock in conditions that would have stopped most men, even some of Emma's critics, had to acknowledge the courage and skill demonstrated by her actions. Cooper Hayes, confronted at the saloon by men who'd read the article, grudgingly admitted, "I guess maybe she's tougher than she looks." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was a shift, a small crack in the wall of prejudice. William Drummond, however, refused to be swayed. He declared the whole thing probably exaggerated, that anyone could get lucky once, that it proved nothing about Emma's long-term capabilities. But his voice sounded less certain now, and fewer people seemed to be listening. In the weeks that followed, something subtle changed in how Copper Ridge viewed Emma Sullivan. She was no longer just that deaf girl Calloway hired. She was becoming Emma from the Circle C, the one who saved those cattle in the blizzard. Her deafness was becoming just one fact about her rather than the defining fact. It was progress. Small, incremental, but real. Emma continued her work through the rest of the brutal winter, each day building her skills and her reputation. She learned to doctor sick animals, to deliver difficult births, to make repairs to equipment and buildings. She continued teaching the minister's daughter sign language during occasional visits to town, planting seeds of possibility in other families with deaf children, and she continued to prove, day after day, that capability had nothing to do with hearing and everything to do with determination, skill, and the willingness to do what needed to be done, regardless of the cost. The storm had tested her. She had survived. And in surviving, she had proven something not just to the community, but to herself, that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, living a life that mattered in ways she'd never imagined possible. Outside, the Montana winter continued its assault on the land. But inside the Circle C ranch, Emma Sullivan slept soundly, her conscience clear, her place secure, and her future, for the first time in her life, bright with genuine possibility. Spring arrived in Montana with the sudden drama that characterized everything in the territory. One day the land lay buried under snow, and seemingly overnight the ice began to break, creeks swelled with runoff, and the first brave shoots of grass pushed through the thawing earth. Emma had survived her first Montana winter, and the accomplishment felt more significant than any she'd achieved before. 6 months had passed since that terrifying day at the Copper Ridge station. 6 months since she'd stepped off the stagecoach expecting rejection, and found instead a weathered rancher who'd learned her language. The transformation in that time had been profound, not just in Emma's skills and confidence, but in the community's understanding of what was possible. On a warm April morning, Jacob called Emma to the ranch house parlor. His expression was serious, and Emma felt a flutter of anxiety. Had she done something wrong? Was this the moment when he finally decided she wasn't worth the trouble? But when Jacob began to sign, his message was entirely different. "I've been thinking about the future, about what happens to this ranch when I'm gone. Thomas has no interest in ranching, he's made that clear. Which means, eventually, the Circle C will be sold to whoever has the money to buy it." Emma wasn't sure where this was going, but she listened carefully. Jacob continued, "I don't want that. This ranch represents 30 years of my life, Margaret's dreams, everything we built together. I want it to continue, to be more than just land and cattle. I want it to stand for something." He paused, then signed something that made Emma's heart stop. "I want to offer you a partnership, not as an employee but as a co-owner. 20% to start, with the opportunity to buy more over time. This ranch needs someone who understands what it means, who'll continue what Margaret and I started. I think that person is you." Emma stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. She signed, "You want me to own part of the ranch?" "Me too, yes," Jacob signed simply. "You've proven yourself 100 times over. You work harder than anyone I've employed. You're learning faster than I dared hope. But more than that, you understand what this place means. You fought to belong here, and that fight makes you appreciate what you have. I trust you with the Circle C's future." Emma's hands trembled as she signed, "I don't have money to buy a partnership." You'll work for it, Jacob signed. We'll draw up papers. Your labor, your expertise, your partnership in building this ranch, that's your investment. In 5 years, you'll own 20% outright. In 10 years, if you want, you could own the majority. This could be your ranch, Emma, your legacy. The weight of what he was offering crashed over Emma like a wave. She wasn't just a hired hand anymore, not just someone temporarily tolerated. She was being offered permanence, ownership, a future that extended beyond the next season or the next crisis. She was being offered a home in the truest sense, not just a place to sleep, but a place that would be hers, that she would build and protect and eventually pass on. Tears streamed down her face as she signed. Why? Why would you do this for me? Jacob's weathered face softened, and he signed with careful deliberation. Because Margaret taught me that legacy isn't about blood. It's about values. It's about passing on what matters to someone who'll honor it. You honor this ranch with every day of work. You honor what Margaret and I believed about people and potential. And frankly, you've become the family I thought I'd lost when Thomas left for California. He paused, then added, also, because the look on William Drummond's face when he learns a deaf woman owns part of the Circle C will be absolutely priceless. Emma laughed through her tears, a sound she rarely made. Awkward and unpracticed, but genuine. She signed, I accept, and I promise I'll make you proud. I'll make this ranch everything it can be. You already have, Jacob signed. The news of Emma's partnership spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. Reactions were predictably mixed. Thomas Brennan wrote a celebratory article. Catherine Wells and the progressive women of the town organized a small celebration. Several other ranchers privately congratulated Jacob on finding a solution to his succession problem. But William Drummond was apoplectic. He ranted at the saloon that Jacob had lost his mind, that giving ownership to a deaf girl was the height of foolishness, that it proved everything he'd said about sentiment destroying sound business judgment. Few people listened. Emma's actions over the winter, the fence repairs, the cattle rescue, the countless days of competent, uncomplaining work had built a reputation that even prejudice couldn't completely erase. She might not be universally accepted, but she was universally acknowledged as a capable rancher who'd earned her place. That summer, 3 significant things happened. First, a family from Wyoming arrived in Copper Ridge with their 12-year-old deaf son. They'd read Thomas's articles about Emma and had traveled specifically to meet her, hoping to learn how to better support their child's future. Emma spent days with them, teaching basic signs, sharing her experiences, connecting them with resources she'd discovered. When they left, the mother embraced Emma and whispered words Emma could read on her lips. You've given us hope. Thank you. Second, the territorial government in Helena began discussions about establishing a school for deaf children in Montana. Elizabeth Morrison, the lawyer who'd written to Jacob, was spearheading the effort and had cited Emma's story as evidence that deaf individuals, given proper education and opportunity, could contribute fully to frontier society. The school would take years to establish, but the seed had been planted. Third, Jacob's son Thomas made a surprise visit from San Francisco. He'd read his father's letters about Emma and had come, he admitted, partly out of curiosity and partly out of concern that his father was being taken advantage of. It took less than a day for Thomas to understand. He watched Emma work, saw the respect Pete and Sam showed her, witnessed the easy communication that had developed between his father and this young woman who'd somehow become part of their family. At dinner that evening, Thomas signed haltingly, having learned basics from a book on the train, to Emma. I was wrong to doubt. You're good for him. For the ranch. Thank you for giving him purpose again. Emma signed back, with Jacob translating. He gave me everything. A home, a future. His family. The thanks go to him. No, Thomas said aloud. The thanks go to both of you. You've built something remarkable here. Something that goes beyond ranching. You've built proof that people are capable of more than society tells them they are. As autumn approached and Emma's first full year at the Circle C neared completion, she found herself reflecting on the journey. A year ago, she'd been hopeless, convinced this would be just another rejection in a long line of them. Now she owned 20% of a thriving ranch, had genuine friends, was teaching other deaf children and their families, and was helping to change attitudes throughout the territory. One evening, as Emma sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jacob joined her. They sat in comfortable silence, something only possible between people who'd learned to communicate beyond words. Finally, Jacob signed, "Do you remember what I asked you that first day? If you could do the work?" Emma nodded. "You've done more than the work," Jacob signed. "You've changed what people think is possible. You've proven that limitations exist primarily in minds, not in bodies or abilities. You've built a life that matters, Emma. Never doubt that." Emma signed back. "I almost didn't come. Almost told the agency to find someone else, that I couldn't face another rejection. If I'd given up then, I'd have missed all of this. But you didn't give up," Jacob signed. "That's what makes your story powerful. Not that you were given a chance, but that you were brave enough to take it despite every reason to believe it would end like all the others. That's real courage." They sat together as the stars emerged, two people who'd found each other across seemingly impossible differences and had built something neither could have created alone. A partnership, a family, a legacy. Emma Sullivan had arrived in Copper Ridge expecting nothing. She'd found everything. And in the process, she'd proven that when one person has the courage to take a chance and another has the wisdom to give one, miracles become possible. The laughter that had greeted her at the station that first day seemed like a lifetime ago. It belonged to a different Emma, a girl who'd been afraid, uncertain, convinced she'd never belong anywhere. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her worth, who'd earned her place, who stood as living proof that the human spirit, given respect and opportunity, could overcome any obstacle. Years later, when Emma's name appeared on the deed to the Circle C Ranch as majority owner after Jacob's peaceful death at age 71, people throughout Montana would remember her story. They'd remember the deaf girl who'd arrived to Mockery and had transformed it into respect through nothing more complicated than hard work, determination, and the refusal to accept others' limitations as her own reality. But on this autumn evening, with the future still unwritten and the stars emerging overhead, Emma simply sat beside the man who'd changed her life and allowed herself to feel something she'd never truly felt before. Contentment. She was home. She was valued. She belonged, and that made all the difference. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.